Welcome to the Training for Translators podcast.
Do better work, earn more money, and enjoy your job with our weekly episodes for ambitious freelance translators and interpreters.
Visit our website at trainingfortranslators.com to subscribe to our newsletter, learn more about our upcoming classes, or read blog post versions of our podcast.
Now here's your host, Corinne McKay.
Greetings, Training for Translators listeners. This is Corinne McKay with episode 5 of the Training for Translators podcast, an episode about how I make this podcast. I thought that some of you might wonder, either for your own podcast creation purposes or just because you're curious, that it might be interesting to hear a little bit about the technical aspects of how I make the podcast, what I do myself, what I hire other people to do. And I particularly wanted to do this while it's fresh in my mind because I recorded 4 episodes. Today is the 5th, and I wanted to sort of get this down on paper, get this down on MP3 before I forget it. So first, a bit of the origin story of the Training for Translators podcast. This is not my first round hosting a podcast. In fact, my friend and colleague Yves Baudot and I hosted the Speaking of Translation podcast for almost 13 years. No kidding. But the technical options and audio standards have changed a lot since we started Speaking of Translation, and I might at some point consider monetizing this podcast through sponsorships or ads, which we never did with Speaking of Translation. So I wanted to sort of professionalize it a little bit before I started. And for anyone who is interested, the Speaking of Translation archives are still there at speakingoftranslation.wordpress.com, and you can still listen to them. The number one thing that I did when I launched this podcast was to decide that at least at the outset, I don't really have the time or energy to create all new content or do interviews. So I settled on the idea of repurposing the content. To my shock and horror, I have now been blogging long enough and prolifically enough that there are more than 1,060 posts on the Training for Translators blog, which you can just find at trainingfortranslators.com. And I actually thought, I bet that even if I just went through and read old posts and commented on them, that would be appealing to a different audience of people than the people who listen to my blog, because it provides a different way to consume the information. Like, I know I personally am actually much more likely to listen to a podcast than to read a blog post, because after, sort of staring at the screen all day at work, I like to listen to podcasts to sort of use my brain or consume information in a different way. So I decided to go with repurposing my past blog posts with commentaries. Once I had that idea, the next question was the tech part. And like I said, since Eve and I started Speaking of Translation way back in the early 2000s, there are some things that are still the same, and there are a lot of things that are really different. Number one thing I stuck with was that Eve and I had always used the hosting company Libsyn. If you have never heard of it, that's Libsyn. I'll put them in the show notes. I believe it originally stood for Liberated Syndication. And I think now they just go by Libsyn. We had used that for Speaking of Translation. I think Eve actually found Libsyn. I didn't know anything about podcasting when Eve and I first started, and I think Eve found it. So we had used Libsyn, and Libsyn is still sort of the main game in town when it comes to podcast hosting. And I found that it's a nice balance between enough features that it has everything that I need, which I'll talk about later, but it's really not that hard to learn to use. Like the basic features are not difficult to learn to use. And I find that most of the default options on Libsyn fit my needs. I use the Libsyn basic plan, which costs $7 a month for 3 hours of audio time or 162 megabytes of storage. And honestly, I haven't looked deeply into it enough to figure out whether that's like whichever comes first. Do you get to put up 3 audio hours as long as it doesn't exceed 162 meg? 162 meg as long as it doesn't exceed 3 hours. But I felt that for myself, because I am aiming for once a week episodes of not more than half an hour, that I felt that that basic plan would be sufficient for me, and $7 a month is certainly reasonable. Now, the big difference between the Training for Translators podcast and what we used to do with Speaking of Translation is that I wanted to learn how to use Audacity. So that's Audacity, and I'll put that in the show notes as well. It is free software for recording and editing audio, and it is extremely full-featured. It has tons of features that I don't think I'll ever need or won't ever need to learn how to use, but it has a lot of really great features. At the outset, here's sort of a pro tip. I thought, well, I should take a class in how to use Audacity. I'm a real class taker person. I love online courses. So I thought I'll take an Audacity class, but in reality, I found so many good free YouTube tutorials that I didn't even need to pay for a class. And I found with the YouTube tutorials, they were exactly what I needed, because I could sort of, I've never done audio engineering before, so I could sort of watch one skill, pause the YouTube video, practice what they taught you, and then go back to the YouTube video. It worked extremely well for me. And for those, I think there are so many, just Google something like basic Audacity tutorial, and you'll find an instructor and skills that match what you're looking to learn. Now, the reason why I decided to use Audacity is because I really wanted to record very crisp sounding audio, and I wanted to add some things that we never did on Speaking of Translation. For example, I wanted to record my own mid-roll spot. So if you're not familiar with that term, it's the promotional material that comes in the middle of a podcast or partway through a podcast. And I'm actually not going to put a mid-roll in this episode, but if you listen to any of the other episodes of Training for Translators, you will hear the mid-roll spot, and I'll talk about how I created that. So the skills that I wanted to learn in Audacity were how to edit out breathing and swallowing noises, and that's something that I'm going to talk about more in the microphone section, which is next. And then I really wanted to learn how to create little spots where I could overlay myself talking over some music. So one thing that I think is helpful is when you run an advertisement or just your own promo. I just do my own promos. So far, I promote Training for Translators, is to indicate that that is not part of the narrative section of the podcast by using music behind it. So it took me maybe 2 hours to learn both of those skills, how to edit out the breathing and swallowing noises, and how to create a mid-roll spot that is me talking over music. I found a couple of websites that have copyright-free music. Again, those are very easy to find. Just Google them. And I'd say it took maybe 2 hours of Audacity tutorials and practice to learn how to do what I wanted to do, which I thought was reasonable. Next, let me talk about microphones. This to me was probably the biggest deal in my podcast creation process. Originally, and I had even solicited input from a couple of other podcast creators. Originally, my thought was that I would just use my interpreting headset. So I have a nice Audio-Technica interpreting headset that has a good microphone on it. But after testing that and running it by a couple of interpreting colleagues, I decided that it didn't have the sound quality I was looking for. It's decent. I use it for all of my interpreting assignments. Clients like it. I'm very happy with it as an interpreting headset. But after a recommendation from a few people, and most notably my interpreting friend and colleague Amélie Roy up in Canada, I decided to buy a Shure MV7 Plus microphone, and Shure is spelled Shure. And I would say that is sort of one of the industry standard, mid-priced podcasting microphones. I paid $279 US for the microphone and $20 for a boom arm stand for it. If you buy the Shure MV7 Plus, you have to buy some sort of stand because it does not come with any stand at all. The only thing that you can do is like hold it in your hand. Which I wouldn't recommend. You have to buy some kind of stand. And so I decided to buy one of those boom arm stands that clips to the side of your desk, and you can rotate the microphone back and forth, closer to you, farther away, however you want to position it. And that $20 stand is completely adequate for my purposes. And the Shure MV7 Plus, I think what part of what the plus is that it comes with a USB-C cable. So a lot of higher end studio microphones, you can only plug into an audio mixing device or an audio mixing panel, not directly into the computer. But the MV7 Plus is pretty simple. It came with a USB-C cable. You don't need any other connectors. I just plugged it in and it worked great right out of the box. So after you choose a microphone, the next battle is microphone positioning. I read a lot of Reddit threads by audio engineers about how to get that sort of radio announcer sound. You have to put the microphone really what I would consider quite close to your mouth. The metric that I read that has worked really well for me is to have the microphone be fist distance from your mouth. So basically, put your fist on your mouth and then put the microphone against the other side of your fist, and that's about the distance that you want. I had read a couple of people who recommended trying really close microphone positioning, like 1 to 2 inches. For me, I got too much like mouth noise for my taste, and then farther away than that sounded pretty echoey. So first of all, you want to come up with the optimal distance for the microphone from your mouth, and for me, that is 1 fist. Then you have to figure out how to optimally position either the microphone or your head so that you get the sound quality that you want in terms of sort of popping, like plosive noise, inhale, exhale kinds of things. So here's what I mean by that. Right now, I find that for my speaking style, which I'll talk about more in the editing section, for my speaking style, it works best if I turn my head at about a 45-degree angle to the microphone. I'll talk later in the editing section about what happens if I speak directly into the flat front surface of the microphone. But for me, although this sounds a bit odd, this is how I'm talking to you right now. It is exactly the angle of the second monitor on my computer. So for example, I run Audacity on my main laptop screen, and then I have my second monitor off to the right of that at about a 45-degree angle, and I put the podcast script on that, and that is exactly the angle that works well for me for the sound that I like. And one thing I would say, this is pretty obvious, but it's a little esoteric if you're not really a sound engineering person. Sound quality is very personal. So you are going to have a personal preference for warmer sound versus crisper sound. Sound that sounds crisp to you might sound like tinny to someone else. Something that sounds warm to you might sound sort of fuzzy, mushy to someone else. So ask people for their opinions or buy a couple of microphones that are returnable to see what you think. Next, let's move on to editing. Another big difference between the Training for Translators podcast and what we did for Speaking of Translation is that Eve and I used to do Speaking of Translation in only 1 take. So we did not re-record anything or edit anything out unless something like really horrible happened. If one of us had, I don't know, the smoke alarm go off or like the neighbor's dog was barking right in our window, we would eliminate that. But I think for a sort of informal conversational podcast, it was totally fine the way we used to record it. We would just use regular, computer headsets, and we did not edit anything out. Again, I have a different type of content for this podcast, and so I wanted a different type of sound quality. Now, the hard part with a sensitive microphone, when I'm talking about, you're sort of riding the line between sensitivity and it picking up every single thing that you don't want to hear. The hard part is that to get that sort of radio newscaster sound, you have to use a sensitive microphone that sits pretty close to your mouth. But then it's going to pick up absolutely every sound, even if you use a pop filter. And I sort of knew this about myself before, but it's so much more apparent than when you listen to yourself recorded on a sensitive microphone. I'm a heavy breather. I blame this on maybe too many years of yoga, something like that. But I am a pretty heavy breather. I breathe very audibly. So for right now, for the length of my episodes, which are all, under a half hour, more like 20 minutes sometimes, I just go back and manually edit out the major breathing and swallowing noises. I do that in Audacity, and you'll pretty quickly come to recognize the waveform or the sound print of what it looks like when you breathe or swallow. So I go through and edit the major stuff out, and then without listening to it, and then I listen to it and do a little finer tuned editing. Now, the hard part here is again, you're going to have personal preferences. I even heard an audio engineer on this, Reddit audio engineer subreddit for audio engineering say that she thinks that no breathing sounds sound weird. It's like when you watch a video of a person who doesn't blink, it looks kind of unnatural. So what I do is I go through and edit out those breathing and swallowing sounds, but I don't do it to a crazy extent, because I think also it is tough if you're not a professional audio engineer to edit out the breathing noises that lead into or out of a word, because it sounds like the word is cut off. Now, I'm sure that someone with way better audio editing skills than I have does know how to do that you can, sort of fade in or fade out, but I don't know how to do that. And I actually am somewhat interested now to know, how do radio stations do this with live shows? Like when you listen to, NPR interview shows, you can't hear the hosts breathing, even though they're recording it live. So I don't know whether they use really expensive microphones or whether they use sound gates. So that's one concept that I did learn, is that, for example, you can set a threshold for what the microphone does not pick up, or you can set it in the recording software. So maybe they use a sound limiter that doesn't pick up breathing. There is also at least one app that you can use post-production that says that it will automatically edit out breathing noises. Those are all things that I would like to look into, but I would say for right now, the audio engineering portion takes me less than an hour per one episode. And it's actually kind of fun because it's so different than the other work that I do all the time. The next thing that I did was to hire a voiceover team to do the intro and the outro. The team that I hired is called Shadow Studio, and I actually found them on Fiverr. Not to cheap out, I was totally willing to pay real money, but because it is really easy on Fiverr to find and compare a whole bunch of voiceover artists, and because I thought from the beginning that I wanted both a man and a woman. And that is actually something that a marketing tip that I would offer to other voiceover studios, is that one of the reasons that I picked Shadow Studio is because they offer the option of having two different voices, one man, one woman. And that was something that really appealed to me. This sounds weird, but I think you guys will get what I mean. I also liked that they were Canadian. The Shadow Studio voiceover artists are Canadian. And not only because I love Canada, I do love Canada, but because my audience is very international, and I actually considered the possibility of using someone who had a non-US accent in English, and then an identifiably, non-US accent, Eastern European accent, something like that. But then I thought, these Canadians are kind of perfect because their accent is not super identifiable, but it's not American. So I wrote the intro and outro scripts, and it cost me $111 US for the two of them together, which I thought was reasonable. And another thing I liked about Shadow Studio is that, and again, tip for other voiceover artists who are out there, they offered the option to send them a voice recording of me pronouncing things like my own name and other, key terms that are in the script. I think for me, it was mostly my name. But that I thought, rather than trying to type out, how you pronounce my name, like it's not Corinne, it's not Corinne. That I thought that was really, a sort of simple but really cool thing that they offer the option, like just send us a voice memo of you saying your name. Then putting it all together. So as I said, what I do is go through and I actually end up with 5 different files. The intro is the same every time. Then I record the first segment of the episode. I go through and remove the breathing and swallowing noises from that. I have the mid-roll, which is so far the same every time. I'll need to record a new one at some point, but so far for all 4 previous episodes, I've used the same one. Then I record the second segment of the episode and I go through and edit the breathing and swallowing out of that. And then I have the outro, which is the same every time. So that results in 5 MP3 files. Then I stitch them together in Audacity. So if you use Audacity and you don't know how to do that, you put all of the tracks in a line. I'm sure there's a term for that. You put all of the tracks in the audio 1 line. Then you do select all, you go to the tracks menu, and then it's called align end to end. So that stitches it all together and you export that as an MP3 file, and that is the episode sound file. I then upload that to Libsyn and I choose where it gets distributed to. Right now, I'm doing Apple Podcasts and Spotify, but for example, they offer the option to do like iHeartRadio, YouTube, lots of other places. And I then put it on my website as well, as a post on the Training for Translators blog. And for what it's worth, this is surely specific to everyone's audience, but that has actually been extremely popular. It outpaces Libsyn direct listens. So the number of people who go to my website, or at least who look at the episode page, is more than the number of people who listen to it in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So if you were doing a podcast for translators and interpreters, I would highly recommend putting it on your own website too, because people seem to like that. To wrap up, I thought I would talk a little bit about what I see as maybe the future of the podcast, but who really knows? So right now, I have about 500 listens to every episode. And once that gets up to about 1,000 listens per episode, which Eve and I did with Speaking of Translation, so I think it's, possible, maybe not right away, but possible for the Training for Translators podcast. I would like to think about maybe monetizing the podcast by selling ads or sponsorships. I'm not really sure what form that would take, because obviously there are lots of different possibilities. You can just go through a, podcast ad serving service. I don't know if 1,000 listens an episode would be enough, but there are, such services that just, they sell ads for you into your podcast, or whether I would approach companies whose products I use for translation and interpreting and see if they would want to advertise, or if they would want to sponsor an episode. I don't know, but that's my thought right now. And then, of course, the other thing I would like to consider for the future is interviews. A few listeners have already asked me about that, whether I would consider doing interview episodes in the future. And yes, I would. I just wanted to start out with something that I knew would be sustainable. And I thought, okay, if the episodes are really just me talking, that feels like something that I can keep up with to do it every week. And so far, I feel like I'm achieving the goals that I set for the podcast, because the people who have contacted me about it or who have reviewed it online are not like the usual suspects. They're not my habitual blog readers or people I recognize as habitual blog readers, or people who typically respond to my newsletter, which tells me that I am reaching a different audience. So if you too are thinking about starting a podcast, or you wonder how podcasts are created, there's some insight. Well, that brings us to the end of episode 5 of the Training for Translators podcast. The podcast is hosted by me, Corinne McKay. The intro and outro were created and recorded by Shadow Studio. The podcast is technologically hosted on Libsyn, and it is recorded and edited in Audacity using a Shure MV7 Plus microphone. Thanks, and I'll talk to you in a future episode.
Thanks for listening to the Training for Translators podcast, helping you do better work, earn more money, and enjoy your job.
To leave a comment, learn more about our upcoming classes, or read blog post versions of our podcast, visit our website at trainingfortranslators.com.
If you enjoy the Training for Translators podcast, please tell your colleagues and friends about it and leave us a review in your favorite podcast app.